The sky burned orange and red as explosions tore through the city of Korath Prime, and Lieutenant Daniel Carter pressed his back against a crumbling wall, while debris rained down around him like deadly snowflakes. The year was 2347, and humanity had been locked in a brutal war with the Valorian Empire for almost 10 years, a conflict that had claimed millions of lives on both sides and left entire worlds scarred beyond recognition. Daniel was 29 years old, with short brown hair and tired green eyes that had seen far too much death for someone so young, and he served aboard the human battleship Horizon's Edge as part of an elite ground assault team tasked with the most dangerous missions. The Valorians were unlike anything humanity had ever encountered before, standing nearly 8 feet tall with silver-blue scales covering their powerful bodies and razor-sharp claws that could tear through standard armor like paper. They viewed humans as weak and fragile, creatures who had no right to claim the stars, calling them softskins and vermin in their harsh guttural language. Daniel had killed many of them over the years, and he knew they had killed many of his friends in return. So there was no love lost between the two species. "Carter, move up!" shouted Sergeant Victor Grant through the comm system, his voice crackling with static as another explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. Daniel pushed forward through the smoke-filled streets, his exosuit humming with power as it enhanced his strength and protected him from the toxic air that now filled the ruined city. His squad of 6 soldiers moved like ghosts through the destruction, clearing building after building as they searched for enemy combatants hiding in the rubble. The Valorian colony on Korath Prime had been a major military installation, and the battle to take it had lasted for 3 terrible weeks, leaving nothing but devastation in its wake. Daniel stepped over the body of a fallen Valorian warrior, trying not to look at the frozen expression of rage still visible on its alien face, and he reminded himself that this was war, and that he had no choice but to keep fighting. They entered what had once been a residential district, though now it was nothing more than broken walls and collapsed roofs, and the scattered remains of lives that would never be rebuilt. The fighting here had been especially fierce, and Daniel could see the scorch marks from plasma weapons covering every surface like black paint splashed by a careless artist. "This sector is clear," reported Private Amy Chen, a young woman with short black hair who had only joined the squad 6 months ago, but had already proven herself to be brave and capable. Daniel nodded and was about to signal for them to move on, when he heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. It was a sound so unexpected and so out of place in this nightmare of war that for a moment he thought he must have imagined it. A child was crying. The sound was high and thin and filled with terror, coming from somewhere beneath a massive pile of rubble that had once been a 3-story building. "Did you hear that?" Daniel asked, already moving toward the source of the crying before anyone could answer. Sergeant Grant grabbed his arm with a grip like iron and pulled him back, his weathered face hard and unforgiving beneath his helmet visor. "Leave it," Grant said in a low voice that carried the weight of command. "Whatever is under there is not our concern, and we have orders to clear this sector and move on." Daniel pulled his arm free and stared at his sergeant with defiance burning in his eyes. "There is a child under there," he said. "I am not leaving until I get them out." Grant's expression darkened with anger and frustration. "It is a Valorian child, Carter, and in 10 years, that thing will be trying to kill us just like all the others. So use your head and think about what you're doing." Daniel did not answer, but instead turned and ran toward the rubble, ignoring the shouts of his squadmates as he began searching for the source of the crying. He found the child trapped beneath a heavy beam of metal and stone, pinned in a small pocket of space that had miraculously protected her from being crushed. She was tiny by Valorian standards, probably no more than 3 cycles old, which was roughly equivalent to a human toddler, with pale lavender scales that were still soft and smooth like a newborn's skin. Her eyes were huge and golden, and filled with more fear than any child should ever know. And when she saw Daniel's armored form looming above her, she screamed and tried to scramble away, but could not move. Hey, it's okay," Daniel said softly, as he retracted his helmet so she could see his face. "I am not going to hurt you, little one, I promise." The child stared at him with those enormous golden eyes, her screaming fading to quiet whimpers as she studied this strange, soft-skinned creature, who spoke in sounds she could not understand. Daniel activated his exosuit's enhanced strength and began lifting the debris piece by piece, working carefully to avoid causing a collapse that would crush them both. It took him nearly 20 minutes to clear enough rubble to reach her, and by the time he pulled her free, his arms were shaking with exhaustion and sweat was pouring down his face. The Valorian child weighed almost nothing in his arms, her small body trembling against his chest as she clung to him with surprising strength. "Carter, what the hell are you doing?" Grant demanded as he approached with the rest of the squad, their weapons raised and pointed at the small alien in Daniel's arms. "Lower your weapons," Daniel said in a voice that left no room for argument. "She is just a scared child, kid who has lost everything, and I will not let anyone hurt her." Grant stared at him for a long moment, something unreadable flickering behind his eyes, before he finally signaled for the squad to lower their weapons. "This is a mistake," Grant said quietly, "and it is going to get you killed one day." Daniel looked down at the child in his arms, her golden eyes now watching him with something that might have been curiosity mixed with her fear, and he felt something shift inside his chest. "Maybe," he said, "but I can live with that." The journey back to the evacuation zone was 6 kilometers of hell, with enemy fire and explosions constantly forcing them to change course and take cover. Daniel carried the child the entire way, sharing his water with her when she grew thirsty, and his rations when she grew hungry, speaking softly to her, even though she could not understand a single word. She stopped crying after the first hour, and simply watched him, with those golden eyes, her small clawed hand gripping his armored finger like it was the only safe thing left in her world. When they finally reached the evac zone, Daniel found a group of Valorian prisoners being prepared for transport to a detention facility off-world. He approached the guards and asked them to take the child, to find her family if any still survived, and to make sure she was kept safe. The Valorian prisoners stared at him with expressions of shock and confusion, unable to comprehend why a human soldier would risk his life to save one of their young. One of them, an older female with deep blue scales and kind eyes, stepped forward and gently took the child from Daniel's arms. "Why?" she asked in broken English, the word heavy with disbelief. Daniel looked at the child one last time, at those golden eyes that would haunt his dreams for years to come, and he gave the only answer he had. "Because she needed help," he said. "There." Then he turned and walked away, returning to his squad and his duty and the endless nightmare of war, never expecting to see that child again. His actions were recorded in a military report that no one would ever read, just another small moment of mercy lost in an ocean of violence and death. But the universe has a way of remembering such moments, even when humans forget. And somewhere across the stars, a powerful figure was already learning of what the soft-skinned soldier had done. 3 years had passed since the Battle of Korath Prime, and the galaxy had grown tired of war, tired of death, tired of sending young soldiers to die on distant worlds for causes that no longer seemed worth the terrible cost. The war between humanity and the Valorian Empire had not ended with a clear victory for either side, but rather with an exhausted ceasefire that both species desperately needed. Too many ships had been destroyed, and too many planets had been scarred, and too many families on both sides had lost loved ones who would never return home. Commander Daniel Carter stood at the observation window of Neutral Station Argent, watching the stars glitter like scattered diamonds against the infinite darkness of space, and he felt older than his 32 years. He had been promoted twice since Korath Prime, not because he sought advancement, but because too many officers above him had died, and someone needed to fill the empty positions. Served as a military liaison during the peace negotiations, a role that required him to stand in rooms full of politicians and diplomats, and pretend that years of bloodshed could be erased with handshakes and signed documents. The station itself was a marvel of neutral engineering, built by a third-party species called the Meridians, who had no stake in the human-Valorian conflict, and who charged enormous fees to host diplomatic meetings in their territory. Daniel rarely slept well anymore, and the nightmares that visited him in the darkness were filled with faces of friends he had lost and enemies he had killed. Sometimes he dreamed of golden eyes staring up at him with fear and trust and something else he could never quite name. He had not thought about the child on Korath Prime in a long time, pushing that memory deep down where it could not distract him from his duties, but lately it had been surfacing more and more often. Familiar voice from behind him, and Daniel turned to see Admiral Patricia Cole approaching with a look of concern on her face. Admiral Cole was a stern woman in her late 50s, with silver hair cut short and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing, and she had commanded the diplomatic mission for the past 3 months. "Admiral," Daniel said with a respectful nod, "is there something wrong?" Cole stopped beside him, and for a moment she simply stared out at the stars, with an expression that Daniel could not read. "Something unexpected has happened," she said slowly, as if choosing each word with great care. "The Valorian High Matriarch has made a personal request through diplomatic channels." Daniel felt his eyebrows rise in surprise, because the High Matriarch was the supreme ruler of the entire Valorian Empire, a figure so powerful and so revered that she was considered almost godlike by her people. In 10 years of war, she had never once communicated directly with humans, preferring to let her generals and diplomats speak on her behalf. "What kind of request?" Daniel asked, though something cold was beginning to form in the pit of his stomach. Admiral Cole turned to face him, and her expression was troubled in a way that made Daniel's unease grow even stronger. "She wants a private audience with you, Commander Carter, specifically and by name." Daniel stared at her in complete confusion, unable to understand why the most powerful being in the Valorian Empire would want anything to do with a mid-level human officer. "Me?" he said. "That cannot be right, Admiral. I have never had any contact with the matriarch or anyone in her government." Cole shook her head and handed him a datapad containing the official request, and Daniel read it 3 times before the words finally sank in. "Sovereign Calith Vorthon, High Matriarch of the Valorian Empire, formally requests a private meeting with the human. Designated Commander Daniel Carter, formerly Lieutenant Daniel Carter of the Horizon's Edge Assault Division," the message read. "We have no idea why she wants to see you," Cole said. "And frankly, that makes everyone very nervous, because the matriarch does not make requests. She makes demands, and for her to specifically name a single human officer is unprecedented." Daniel's mind was racing as he tried to think of any possible reason for this strange summons. And then suddenly, a memory surfaced from the depths of his consciousness. Golden eyes and lavender scales, and a small clawed hand gripping his finger. "Korath Prime," he whispered, and Cole's sharp eyes narrowed at his words. "What about Korath Prime?" she asked. Daniel told her about the child he had saved during the battle, about how he had carried her through 6 kilometers of active combat, and given her to the Valorian prisoners to find her family. He had never reported the full details to anyone, and he had certainly never imagined that it would matter 3 years later. Cole listened to his story with growing amazement, and when he finished, she let out a long breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You saved a Valorian child," she said. "In the middle of one of the bloodiest battles of the war, you stopped to rescue an enemy child." "She was just a kid," Daniel said, feeling suddenly defensive. "She was scared and alone and trapped, and I could not just leave her there to die." Cole studied him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression, something that looked almost like respect. "Well, Commander," she said, "it seems your act of mercy has caught the attention of the most powerful being in the Valorian Empire, and now she wants to meet the human who saved one of her people." The meeting was scheduled for the following day in the matriarch's private chambers aboard her flagship, a vessel so massive that it dwarfed the entire neutral station. Daniel spent the night unable to sleep, pacing his small quarters and wondering what the Valorian ruler could possibly want from him. He remembered the way the Valorians he had encountered always looked at humans, with contempt and disgust and barely concealed hatred. They saw humanity as an infestation, as vermin who had spread across the galaxy like a disease. And Daniel had seen that hatred transform into violence, more times than he could count. What would the matriarch see when she looked at him? Would she see just another soft-skinned enemy to be despised, or would she see something else? The next morning, Daniel dressed in his formal uniform and reported to the shuttle bay where a Valorian transport was waiting to take him to the matriarch's ship. Admiral Cole was there to see him off, her face carefully neutral, but her eyes betraying her worry. "Be careful," she said quietly. "We have no idea what she really wants from you, and if something goes wrong, we may not be able to help you." Daniel nodded and squared his shoulders and walked toward the waiting shuttle, feeling like he was stepping off a cliff into darkness. The Valorian guards who escorted him aboard were massive and intimidating, their silver-blue scales gleaming under the ship's lights, and their golden eyes tracking his every movement with predatory interest. They did not speak to him, and he did not try to speak to them, and the silence that filled the shuttle was heavy with unspoken tension. As the ship carried him toward his meeting with the most powerful being in the Valorian Empire, Daniel could not shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he could not possibly imagine. He thought about the child he had saved, about those golden eyes filled with fear that had slowly transformed into trust, and he wondered if she was still alive somewhere. He wondered if she remembered him at all, and deep in his heart, buried beneath years of war and pain and loss, a small spark of hope began to flicker. Maybe, just maybe, one act of mercy could make a difference. Maybe it already had. The matriarch's throne room was unlike anything Daniel had ever seen, a vast chamber carved from what appeared to be living crystal that pulsed with soft inner light and stretched so high above him that the ceiling vanished into shadows. Valorian guards lined both sides of the chamber, each one standing perfectly still, like statues carved from silver and blue stone, their golden eyes following Daniel as he walked the impossibly long path toward the throne at the far end. His boots echoed against the crystal floor with each step, and the sound seemed to multiply and bounce off the walls until it felt like 100 men were marching beside him. Daniel kept his spine straight and his head high, refusing to show any sign of the fear that was churning in his stomach. He was a soldier, and he had faced death many times, but this was different, because he was completely alone in the heart of enemy territory, with no weapons and no backup and no idea what was about to happen. The throne itself was carved from a single piece of crystallized starlight, or so he had been told, a material so rare and precious that even a small fragment was worth more than most planets. And seated upon that throne was Sovereign Caliph Vorthon, High Matriarch of the Valorian Empire. She was ancient by Valorian standards, her scales a deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb the light around her, rather than reflect it. and her eyes burned with an intensity that made Daniel feel like she was staring directly into his soul. She was beautiful in the way that a storm is beautiful, or a supernova, or any other force of nature that could destroy you in an instant without even noticing your existence. Daniel stopped at the designated distance from the throne, exactly 20 paces as protocol demanded, and he bowed his head in the manner he had been taught. "Sovereign Caliph," he said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "Commander Daniel Carter of the Human Alliance, and I am honored by your summons." For a long moment the matriarch simply studied him, her burning eyes moving slowly over his face and body, as if she was memorizing every detail. The silence stretched on until Daniel began to wonder if he had done something wrong, if perhaps he had offended her with his words, or his posture, or simply by existing. Then she spoke, and her voice was like thunder rolling across mountains, deep and powerful, and impossible to ignore. "You are smaller than I expected," she said, "softer, weaker, more fragile than I imagined a warrior capable of such deeds would be." Daniel was not sure how to respond to that, so he remained silent and waited for her to continue. The matriarch rose from her throne and descended the crystal steps with a grace that seemed impossible for a being of her size, her midnight blue scales catching the light and creating patterns that danced across the. She stopped directly in front of Daniel, close enough that he could feel the heat radiating from her body, and she towered over him like a giant from ancient mythology. "You are the one who saved the child on Korath Prime," she said, and it was not a question, but a statement of absolute certainty. "Yes, Sovereign," Daniel replied. "I am." "Tell me why," she demanded, her eyes boring into his with an intensity that made it impossible to look away. "Tell me why a human soldier, in the middle of a war that had claimed countless lives on both sides, would risk everything to save an enemy child." Daniel took a deep breath and thought about his answer carefully, knowing that whatever he said in this moment could determine whether he lived or died. "Because she was a child," he said finally. "Because she was scared and alone and crying, and because I could not walk away and leave her to die. Not when I had the power to save her." "Was Valorian?" the matriarch pressed. "Even though her people had killed your friends, your comrades, your own species by the millions?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Even so, because she had not killed anyone. She was just a child who needed help, and in that moment nothing else mattered." The matriarch stared at him for what felt like an eternity, her ancient eyes searching his face for any sign of deception or hidden motive. Then she did something that shocked Daniel to his core, something that made the guards lining the chamber gasp in collective disbelief. She bowed her head to him. "That child was Valera," the matriarch said, her voice now soft and filled with an emotion that Daniel could not quite identify. "She was my granddaughter, the daughter of my daughter who died in that same battle, the last surviving member of my direct bloodline." Daniel felt the world tilt beneath his feet as the weight of her words crashed over him like a wave. "Forces retook the city. They found her alive because of you," the matriarch continued. "She had been cared for by the prisoners you entrusted her to, and she still speaks of the soft-skinned creature who carried her through fire and shared his water when she was dying of thirst." "I did not know who she was," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I did not know she was important." "That is precisely why what you did matters," the matriarch said, and when she raised her head, her eyes were glistening with something that looked impossibly like tears. "You did not save her because she was royal, or valuable, or useful. You saved her because she was a child in need, and no Valorian warrior would have done the same for a human child." She stepped back and spread her arms wide, her voice now carrying to every corner of the vast chamber. "By the ancient laws of my people, I owe you a life debt that cannot be repaid with words or gifts or treasures. You saved royal blood. You preserved my lineage when it would have been lost forever, and for that I am claiming you." "Claiming me?" Daniel repeated, confusion cutting through his shock. "I do not understand what that means, Sovereign." It means you will return with me to Valoria, the matriarch said, and her tone left absolutely no room for argument or negotiation. You will be honored as a protector of the royal house. You will live among my people, and you will teach us what manner of species produces warriors capable of such impossible compassion. Daniel's mind was reeling as he tried to process what was happening. Sovereign, he said carefully, I am grateful for the honor you offer, but I have duties and responsibilities to my own people. I cannot simply abandon them. The matriarch's eyes hardened, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. This is not a request, Commander Carter, she said, her voice now carrying the weight of absolute authority. This is the will of the Valorian Empire, and you will comply. She moved closer again, and this time there was something almost gentle in her expression. Your people sent you to help build peace between our species, she said, and I am offering you the chance to do exactly that in a way no human has ever been able to before. You will be the bridge between our worlds, the living proof that mercy can exist even in the darkest times of war. Daniel looked up at the ancient Valorian ruler and saw not just power and authority in her eyes, but also grief and hope and a desperate need for something she could not name. He thought about the child he had saved, about Valera with her golden eyes and lavender scales, and he thought about all the death and destruction that 10 years of war had brought to both their peoples. If I agree to this, he said slowly, what happens to the peace negotiations? What happens to the ceasefire? The matriarch smiled, a thin expression that transformed her fearsome face into something almost beautiful. The ceasefire will hold, she said, and perhaps with your help, it will become something more, something lasting, something that will ensure no more children on either side will have to cry alone in the rubble of their destroyed homes. Daniel closed his eyes and made a decision that would change the course of history. Then I accept, he said. I will come with you to Valoria. The matriarch inclined her head in acknowledgement, and around them the guards began to stir and whisper among themselves. No human had ever set foot on Valoria. No human had ever been welcomed among the Valorian people. But Daniel Carter was about to become the first, and the galaxy would never be the same. He protected the enemy's child. Now the alien mother demands him. The news of Daniel's decision spread through Neutral Station Argent like wildfire, igniting fierce debates and heated arguments among the human delegation that could be heard echoing through the corridors. Admiral Patricia Cole stood in the center of the command room, her face red with frustration, as she gestured at the holographic display showing the matriarch's flagship. This is madness, she said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. We cannot simply hand over one of our officers to the Valorians like some kind of tribute. It sets a terrible precedent, and it makes humanity look weak. Daniel stood quietly near the window, watching the argument unfold with a strange sense of detachment. He had already made his choice, and nothing anyone said would change his mind. But he understood why his fellow humans were upset, and he did not blame them for their reactions. Raymond Blake, the senior tactical officer, slammed his fist against the table and fixed Daniel with a glare that could have melted steel. Carter, have you completely lost your mind? He demanded. Those aliens killed thousands of our people. They burned our colonies and murdered our civilians. And now you want to go live among them like some kind of honored guest? I want to prevent more killing, Daniel replied calmly. I want to build something that will last longer than either of our lifetimes, and this is the only way I know how to do that. They will never accept you, said Lieutenant Karen Marshall, a young officer with worried eyes who had served with Daniel for 2 years. They hate us, Daniel. They think we are vermin, and the moment the matriarch loses interest in you, they will throw you away like garbage. Daniel turned to face his colleagues and friends, seeing the fear and concern written plainly on their faces. Maybe you are right, he said, quietly. Maybe this will end badly for me. Maybe I will die alone on an alien world surrounded by beings who despise everything I represent." He paused and took a deep breath before continuing. "But what if you are wrong?" he asked. "What if my presence on Valoria can show them that humans are not the monsters they believe us to be? What if one person reaching across the divide can start to heal the wounds that 10 years of war have left on both our peoples?" Admiral Cole walked over to stand in front of him, her sharp blue eyes studying his face as if searching for some sign of doubt or hesitation. "You are throwing away your career," she said. "You are leaving behind everyone who cares about you. You are walking into the unknown with no guarantee that you will ever return." "I know," Daniel said, "but someone has to take the first step. Someone has to be brave enough to try, and if not me, then who?" The room fell silent as his words sank in. A long moment. No one spoke. Then Admiral Cole did something unexpected. She reached out and clasped Daniel's hand in her own, squeezing it gently. "You are either the bravest man I have ever met, or the most foolish," she said, "and I honestly cannot decide which." "Maybe I am both," Daniel replied with a small smile. The farewell ceremony was brief and subdued, with only a handful of officers present to see Daniel off as he boarded the Valorian shuttle that would carry him to his new life. He had packed only a small bag containing a few personal items, some photographs of his family back on Earth, a worn copy of his favorite book, and the dog tags of a friend who had died during the Battle of Korath Prime. As the shuttle lifted off, and the neutral station began to shrink in the viewport, Daniel felt a strange mixture of fear and anticipation churning in his chest. He was leaving behind everything he had ever known, every familiar face and friendly voice, and traveling into the heart of enemy territory where no human had ever been welcomed before. The Valorian guards who escorted him remained silent throughout the journey, their massive forms blocking the exit and making it clear that Daniel was not entirely a free man. When the shuttle finally docked with the Matriarch's flagship, Daniel was led through a maze of corridors that seemed to stretch on forever, passing countless Valorian crew members who stopped and stared at the small human walking among them. Most of them looked at him with undisguised contempt, their golden eyes narrowing and their clawed hands twitching, as if they wanted nothing more than to tear him apart. But a few of them showed something else in their expressions, something that looked almost like curiosity, or even grudging respect. Daniel kept his head high and his pace steady, refusing to show any sign of fear, even though his heart was pounding so hard, he was sure the Valorians could hear it. He was led to a set of quarters that were surprisingly comfortable, with a bed sized for human proportions and a window that offered a stunning view of the stars. "You will remain here until the Sovereign summons you," one of the guards said in heavily accented English. "Food and water will be brought to you. Do not attempt to leave these quarters without escort." Daniel nodded and watched the guards withdraw, leaving him alone in the silence of his new home. He sat down on the bed and buried his face in his hands, allowing himself a moment of weakness now that no one was watching. What had he done? What had he gotten himself into? The door chime sounded softly, startling Daniel out of his thoughts, and he quickly composed himself before calling out permission to enter. The door slid open to reveal a small figure standing in the corridor, a young Valorian female, with scales that shimmered between lavender and pale blue in the background. Artificial light. She was taller than Daniel remembered, having grown considerably in the 3 years since Korath Prime. But those golden eyes were exactly the same. "Valera," Daniel whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The young Valorian stepped into his quarters, and the door slid shut behind her, leaving them alone together for the first time since that terrible day in the burning city. For a long moment, neither of them spoke, simply staring at each other across the small room, as if neither could quite believe the other was real. Then Valera moved forward, slowly at first, but with increasing speed, until she was standing directly in front of Daniel, with her golden eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I remember you," she said in English that was broken but clear, the words obviously practiced many times. "You were warm when everything else was cold." Daniel felt his own eyes beginning to burn as emotion threatened to overwhelm him. "I remember you too," he said. "I never stopped thinking about you, wondering if you were okay, hoping that you had found your family." Valera reached out and took his hand in her clawed grip, the same gesture she had made when she was a frightened child, clinging to the only source of safety in a world that had been torn apart. "My grandmother says you are staying," she said. "She says you will live with us and teach us about humans." "That is true," Daniel replied, "if you will have me." Valera's face broke into a smile that transformed her alien features into something beautiful, and she squeezed his hand with surprising gentleness. "I will teach you about Valorians," she said. "I will show you that we are not all monsters, just as you showed me that humans are not all enemies." Daniel looked down at their joined hands, one soft and pink, and the other scaled and clawed, and he felt something shift inside his chest. This was why he had come, the bridge he needed to build, one connection at a time, one friendship at a time, until the gap between their peoples became small enough to cross. "I would like that very much," he said. And for the first time, since he had made his impossible decision, Daniel felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. Outside the window, the stars continued their eternal dance, indifferent to the small drama unfolding in the quarters of a human visitor. But the universe was watching, and the universe remembered. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, the future was already beginning to change. He protected the enemy's child. Now the alien mother demands him. The first months on Valoria were the hardest of Daniel's life, filled with moments of isolation and loneliness that threatened to crush his spirit entirely. The royal palace was a magnificent structure of crystal and living stone that seemed to grow from the very mountains themselves. But for all its beauty, it was also cold and unwelcoming. Most of the Valorians who lived and worked in the palace refused to speak to Daniel, averting their golden eyes whenever he passed, and muttering words in their native tongue that he suspected were not complimentary. The food was strange, and the customs were stranger, and there were countless times when Daniel made mistakes that earned him looks of contempt and disgust from those around him. But he did not give up, and he did not ask to go home, because every day he spent on Valoria was another day that the ceasefire held. Young Valera became his constant companion and his guide, appearing at his quarters each morning with boundless energy and an endless supply of questions about humanity. She taught him how to speak basic Valorian, correcting his pronunciation with patient laughter when he mangled the harsh consonants and guttural tones. She showed him the gardens where crystal flowers bloomed in colors that had no names in any human language, and she took him to the libraries where ancient histories were recorded in glowing symbols that danced across the walls. In return, Daniel taught her about Earth and its many cultures, about human music and art and literature, about the countless ways that humans express love and joy and sorrow. He told her stories of brave heroes and terrible villains, of wars fought and peace won, of the endless human capacity for both destruction and creation. Valera absorbed it all with hungry curiosity, her golden eyes wide with wonder as she discovered that the species she had been taught to hate was far more complex and beautiful than she had ever imagined. Word of these lessons began to spread through the palace and beyond, and slowly, cautiously, other Valorians began to approach Daniel with questions of their own. A young warrior named Torvik asked about human combat techniques, and was surprised to learn that humans valued discipline and honor just as much as Valorians did. An elderly scholar named Mathrin spent hours discussing philosophy with Daniel, and discovered that humans had been grappling with questions of existence and purpose for thousands of years. A healer named Solara was amazed to learn about human medicine, and the lengths to which humans would go to save a single life, even the life of a stranger. With each conversation and each connection, the wall of hatred and mistrust began to crack just a little bit more. The matriarch watched all of this from her throne, her ancient eyes missing nothing as the impossible slowly became possible. 6 months after Daniel's arrival, she invited him to address the Council of Elders, the ruling body that advised the matriarch on all matters of state. Daniel stood before a room full of the most powerful Valorians in the Empire, beings who had spent their entire lives viewing humans as enemies to be destroyed, and he spoke from his heart. He did not try to excuse the terrible things that both sides had done during the war, and he did not pretend that decades of hatred could be erased overnight. Instead, he talked about the child he had saved on Korath Prime, about the moment when he had looked into her golden eyes and seen not an enemy, but simply a scared little girl who needed help. In that moment, he said, there was no war and there were no sides. There was only a choice between compassion and cruelty, and I chose compassion. He paused and looked around the chamber at the faces of the Valorian elders. Doubt and suspicion, but also something else, something that looked almost like hope. Your people are not my enemies, he continued. They never were. They were simply strangers I had not yet learned to understand. And the same is true for humans from your perspective. We have both lost so much to this war, he said. We have both buried friends and family and watched worlds burn. And we can choose to let that loss define us forever, to keep fighting until there is nothing left of either of our civilizations. Or we can choose something different, he concluded. We can choose to build something new from the ashes, something better than what came before, a future where children of both species can grow up without knowing the fear and hatred that we have known. The chamber was silent for a long moment after he finished speaking, and Daniel wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. Then one of the elders, a grizzled old warrior whose scales bore countless scars from battles long past, rose to his feet. This human speaks words that I would have called impossible a year ago, the elder said, his voice rough with age, but still carrying authority. But I have watched him among us, and I have seen the way young Valera looks at him, and I believe that he means every word. Other elders began to nod, some reluctantly and some with genuine conviction, and Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he had not even realized he was carrying. The ceasefire transformed into a formal peace treaty 3 months later, with trade routes opening and cultural exchanges beginning for the first time in the history of both species. Human and Valorian scientists started working together on projects that neither could have accomplished alone, combining their knowledge to push the boundaries of what was possible. The galaxy watched in astonishment as two mortal enemies slowly and painfully learned to trust each other. The first anniversary of Daniel's arrival on Valoria, the matriarch summoned him to her throne room once more. This time, the vast chamber was filled not only with Valorian nobles and warriors and diplomats, but also with a human delegation led by Admiral Patricia Cole herself. Daniel walked the long crystal path toward the throne, but this time the guards who lined the chamber bowed their heads in respect as he passed. Valera stood at the foot of the throne, her scales now shifting toward the deep royal blue of her grandmother, and her golden eyes shone with pride and love. The matriarch rose from her seat and descended to stand before Daniel, and when she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the chamber. For generations, my people believed that strength was measured by the enemies we destroyed, she said. We believed that mercy was weakness, and that compassion was a flaw to be purged from our warriors. She paused, and her burning eyes swept across the assembled crowd. We were wrong, she declared, and the words echoed through the chamber, like the tolling of a great bell. True strength is not measured by the lives we take, but by the lives we save, she continued. True courage is not found in hatred, but in the willingness to reach across the divide and offer an open hand to those we have been taught to fear. She turned back to Daniel and reached out to place a ceremonial crystal around his neck, a pendant that marked him as a permanent member of the royal household. This human taught us that lesson, she said, not with weapons or threats, but with a single act of compassion in the midst of war. She raised her voice so that it filled the entire chamber and beyond, so that the words would be carried across the stars to every corner of the galaxy. From this day forward, let it be known that humanity is not weak, she proclaimed. They are strong in ways we are only beginning to understand, and we are honored to call them friends. The chamber erupted in cheers and applause from both Valorians and humans, a sound that would have been unimaginable just 1 year before. Daniel stood in the center of it all, a bridge made of flesh and blood and stubborn, quiet courage, and he thought about that burning city on Korath Prime. He thought about a crying child, and a choice made in a single moment, a choice that had seemed so small at the time, but had grown to reshape the destiny of 2 civilizations. Valera approached him and took his hand in hers, her clawed grip gentle and warm, and she smiled up at him with those golden eyes that had haunted his dreams for so many years. Thank you, she said simply, for everything. Daniel squeezed her hand and looked out at the cheering crowd, at the impossible sight of humans and Valorians standing together in celebration. No, he said, thank you for reminding me that even in the darkest times, mercy always matters. And across the galaxy, in the hearts of billions who had known only war and hatred, a small flame of hope began to burn. It was just the beginning, but it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.